Hello and welcome to another edition of the Centre for Creative Health's In Conversation series. My name is Steph Cibich and I'm the Assistant Curator and Program Officer at the Centre for Creative Health. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. A charity of the Hospital Research Foundation, the Centre for Creative Health aims to improve the quality and experience of healthcare through art, music and design. This In Conversation series highlights members of the community that assist CCH in presenting our arts and health programs and allows us to focus on some of the excellent work that these professionals do. Today, I'm joined by local emerging artist Taylor Parham, whose work is currently on display in the Centre for Creative Health Gallery at the Lyell McEwin Hospital here in Adelaide, South Australia. Hello, Taylor. Welcome.
Hi, Steph. How's it going? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Why don't we just kick off? Would you like to maybe start by telling us a bit about your practice?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm just at the moment finishing up a Masters of Design at Uni SA, and my practice is really probably split into two parts. There's kind of an exterior component and an interior kind of component. Yeah, two kind of separate bodies of work which are really similar, but also quite different. So the exterior stuff is something I really enjoy, just going around photographing kind of mundane environments and photographing places that are really familiar but at an unfamiliar kind of time. So I think, maybe a car park or a shopping centre at midnight as opposed to during the day. So it has that really different kind of experience to it. And then the kind of exterior component led to this new kind of graduate work that I produced as part of my master's, this interior project, which is all about photographing kind of hidden spaces, spaces that are kind of different worlds, spaces of research and science and teaching, learning, engineering, industry, all sorts of things that are these spaces which are kind of familiar to a viewer, but really unfamiliar in the sense that you aren't quite sure what they are. You would have no reason to visit one of these places unless you had a reason, which is kind of silly, but it makes sense, trust me.
No, not silly
at
all.
It all comes it all comes to this idea of finding kind of the accidental aesthetics that these places kind of portray. A place that's built with a specific form and function, is used very specifically in an engineering environment or a science or research environment, but it still exhibits these really kind of beautiful aspects that we kind of portray in our own worlds, with kind of clean whites, bright lights, symmetry, all those really kind of aesthetically nice things that people have in their own houses and galleries and stuff, whereas here it's done kind of unintentionally. So two kind of components, two bodies of work that kind of sit together but separate.
Yeah, and I can see the way that they kind of cross and interconnect as well. And I'm sure, I think that's really interesting what you were saying about the form. And I was thinking about some of the lines and like some of the symmetry, like you said, in your work. It's cool. It's a really interesting point of difference. One question I'm really curious about is, how did you come to be taking photos of healthcare spaces and facilities? What brought you to take photos of those specific environments?
Yeah, so when I was doing my Bachelor's of Arts at Uni SA again, I was a part-time student, and so my kind of graduate work, my grad show was split over 2 years. So I had an opportunity to kind of work on those kind of exterior photos, and then for the second kind of go round, I took some pictures just at a local Woolworths, just having worked there part-time. I was there at nights and stuff, and just was interested by the space, when it's, not filled with people shopping and all this kind of stuff. And so took some photographs in kind of the Woolworths and exhibited them, and had a really kind of interesting response from other people, but also from myself, really enjoying being in those spaces. And then deciding to go on with my master's, and gave me an opportunity to maybe focusing a little bit more on that. And luckily enough, I have just a couple doors down, a long-time friend and neighbour who happens to work as a technician just in one of the departments at Adelaide Uni. We got chatting up in front of his place or my place, and he mentioned the space and asked me to come along to look at it and showed kind of interest there, and then he, connected me onto a colleague and friend in another department, then to another department, and then I found myself, really enjoying more and more of these spaces, and then decided to kind of make.
They were the training spaces?
Yeah, they're so some of them might be teaching spaces, one such space was, an anatomy lab. So it's, teaching not only, doctors and nurses, but also physiotherapists and stuff. So it's cross kind of disciplinary in that sense. But being at a uni, they were initially all kind of teaching and learning spaces before they kind of get to more specific, engineering and stuff, which has come from that initial point.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, cool. And so are most of the spaces then that you take photos of, are they primarily training environments, or are you starting to get more into some of those more clinical functional spaces too?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something probably touch on a little bit later as well, is those next kind of steps. But yeah, that's a really good point. So starting point, teaching and learning was a really not easy place to get into. Like, there's still difficulties, but it was much more approachable than, going straight to a hospital or straight to, the SAMRI or something like that. So it was quite, easy in that regard to start at that kind of lower end, not to like diminish, the work, but, it's understandable that, accessing, a university lab as opposed to a research lab at the Cancer Institute is much easier. So started from that, and then it also just worked as, an initial kind of project, always remembering that I was doing it as, my graduate work at the time. So there was a sense of like, okay, I've got to do this work, not only because I'm enjoying it and etc., but there's the, the academic side of it as well. So keeping them all teaching, learning kind of, at that time was good to keep it kind of relatable and keep it its own kind of little, body of work amongst, a grander kind of body of work.
So I guess, what do you think appeals to you about working amongst those sorts of environments, or working amongst and kind of capturing the essence of those sorts of spaces?
I think, I think the appeal is just something I've probably had always. Like, I think, as someone that was always, into science fiction and these kind of things, and science and technology and engineering and stuff, all these kind of spaces are always interesting. Even I remember, you just see these, years ago, before I even had the idea to kind of get onto work, you'll see a picture of, the university space from one of their promotional elements or something, and be like, oh, that's a really, cool looking space. Someone that wanted to kind of get into that side, that sciencey engineering, and then chose art. It's a really good way to combine, a passion in photography with a genuine interest. So I've always been interested in doing that. But then I guess as I started doing it more and more, it started to become much more interesting, not only from like an aesthetic kind of point of view, but just from a technology kind of point of view, of, the role that they kind of have, thinking about, all the hospitals, down North Terrace, and photographing, the place where these kids at the time are learning, to get into that environment. It's interesting. It always feels like being, a student at times, like going, having these tours of spaces and then learning a little bit as I'm photographing. So it's always interesting there. It's, that element of learning about something as you photograph, which is something that I'd like to do, is to learn on my own, etc. But here it's like I'm doing a little crash course. So that was always a benefit to it as well.
Yeah, and that would, I imagine you would learn a lot from being in those spaces and having those little tours and somebody generously showing you around. But that would make that connection between you and that space all the more greater, I suppose. That's really cool. I mean, those spaces are generally not. Well, it seems like most of those spaces are not typically accessible to the public. So how do you actually go about getting access and getting into those spaces? Is that difficult?
It's difficult in one sense. It's not difficult to persuade them, I've found, because they don't need persuading. I'll speak to, someone, or initially, like I mentioned, my friends, their neighbour, graciously put me onto his lab and then onto another. So there was an immediate connection there. But I found as I started taking photos, I then had, a portfolio kind of thing that I could then say, this is what I'm doing, being able to show an example or two. And the thing that you find is how interested and how excited, the director of, the department, or even the techies and stuff are to see someone kind of come in and photograph, their space, because it's from the university's point of view, it's, they're really proud of all these spaces that they provide, etc.
Sure.
And these guys work in them, and they don't need persuading to come in and take photos. The people that do need persuading are the facilities management teams and that's kind of stuff, where it's not a matter of, no, you can't do it. It's just, you have to, make sure it's done right. You've got to fill out these forms. You have to let us know when you're doing it, show us the photos, etc. All those kind of things, which is absolutely fine. Like it's certainly not something that I would steer from. Like I wouldn't have backed away from doing this project because of paperwork or something, but it's just tricky. I think also COVID was probably, made things trickier. In it's easier to get permission to do it, but then it's okay, well, we're not in there all the time now, we're working from home, or we're not taking visitors. It's always kind of a bit of a balance. So it's easier than you think. At the university level. The opposite can be said for hospitals and things like that, which I'm kind of in talks with now. It's a lot trickier. But again, that's also the environment. You can imagine, a university being strict on visitors. Imagine what a hospital is like, being strict
100%.
on visitors. And you'd experience that, yourself. So it's
certainly,
and it's not slow going, but it's slow work. I enjoy slow work.
But it's worthwhile.
Nice.
And it means that, by the time that you get to the point where you're able to access the space, yes, there would certainly be some hoops, I suppose, that need to be jumped, and fairly so. But by the time that you get there, then you get to photograph this amazing space and shed light on some of, like you sort of said, that accidental aesthetic quality of that environment. Speaking of the pandemic, though, I guess I was thinking about how we're now more exposed than ever to those I guess frantic scenes of hospitals and healthcare settings, and I guess in contrast, your work offers a really interesting alternative to that vision for some viewers, I'm sure. I guess my question is, how do you think that audiences might connect with your work or find meaning with your work during these particularly strange times?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think hospitals and stuff, even pre-pandemic, can be pretty frantic, can't they? So
That's true.
It's interesting in that sense.
Very true. It just exacerbates it. Yeah,
exactly. But I think that kind of contrast is really kind of good point. I think the connection. I can certainly speak on what I would like them, to connect with, whether they connect with it or not. I mean, we've had experience where we've had a photograph, for Lyell McEwin that was, not quite right for the environment and was taken down because it was maybe a little bit more challenging, which isn't certainly not the intention, is, to challenge people with, a view of something, but that connection is what I want, someone to be, I guess, intrigued by what they're seeing, so to be in a position where they're looking at something and going, okay, this is, familiar in the sense that it's clearly it's a space of science, or it's a, space of research or whatever, but I have no idea like what is going on. And so you can read, into the picture and look at little kind of, there might be specimens, or there might be, tools or whatever. You can get little kind of glimpses as to what this, hidden kind of world is, and then make, decisions based on that. So it's just about kind of, I want them to be stimulated, I guess, intellectually. Like it's not, saying that it's like smart work for smart people. Like it's a silly thing to say, but it's like I want people to look at it and go, oh, this is really nice to look at, sure, but it's also of something. So it's like, well, what is this? What is that? And so that emptiness, is yeah, probably part of it as well. And part of that has come from just the progress of, you know, taking the pictures. It's always easy to start with an empty place before you start to include people.
Sure.
Just as a way of you know, working, organisation and things like that. But I certainly think that's works with what I'm trying to achieve, which is just, you know, a focus kind of on the space, rather than, you know, the people and things like that's equally, you know, important. But for these photographs, it's just the space itself. So it's really just having people want to kind of look at stuff, which as an artist, I guess you want people to look at your work, but it's finding an extra element to keep them kind of looking at the work, keep them engaged rather than walking past and taking a glimpse, going, that's nice, and then continuing on. You want to kind of draw them into that sense.
Yeah, and I think that your work it sparks that curiosity for sure. I think that there's something, of course. I think that there's something familiar. I've never been into most of those spaces. I think that I've seen of your work, but there's something familiar, but curious about some of those things that you can recognize, and it does. It's kind of, you know, it grabs your attention, and then it's sort of, oh, what is this? And then you're engaged, and before you know it, you're wanting to learn more. And I guess that the thing about art is that it's largely subjective, isn't it? You're always going to have somebody interpret that as, oh, this must be this, and whether that's positive or negative. But I think that the beautiful thing is when you get a work that just actually engages you and captures your attention, and maybe even challenges you to think about your own preconceptions or your own connections to that space in this example, you know, and that in itself is just, it's glorious. But I think so.
And there's an interesting thing as well that I'm getting more and more kind of into, I guess, is having taken the pictures, is then there's this element of, you know, portraying science and stuff to, you know, the masses, you know, like there's not only like the aesthetic kind of value, but it's being able to show, you know, what is happening. That's something that science, you know, just in general, you know, I guess struggles with. You know, you think about kind of, you know, climate change and all this kind of, you know, larger kind of more important issues that don't get you know, portrayed, you know, to the environment. You know, there's a real emphasis on how do you share, you know, scientific you know, research, share information with the public. So there's an interesting kind of correlation there between, you know, taking the work there, and something, you know, that I'm kind of thinking more and more about as I take more and more pictures is how do you use that kind of idea of sharing kind of science and shedding a light onto kind of what's happening there, but also, you know, creating kind of the artwork, or, you know, creating art,
doing it through
science
art.
and art are kind of, the two sides of kind of the same coin. So it's interesting kind of, you know, contrast but similarities between the two, which is
I was just going to say there's certainly a lot to be said about the conversations between art and science and the interconnections between art and science. And I know with CCH, obviously, you know, we are arts in health, so it's we're dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. But I think that if nothing else, art and science, they're bound by this sense of curiosity. Again, I think that's something that they share, and that idea of creating, experimenting, growing, learning. I think that that's something that art and science have together, and that's it's great that you're able to explore that in a new and unique and interesting way in your work. I think it's cool. And I wanted to, I guess we've kind of touched on it already, but I wanted to just spend a bit talking about maybe how that work can then have meaning or impact when then it's actually exhibited in a healthcare environment, I suppose. Imagining your works of these healthcare settings or these training facilities exhibited in a classic white cube gallery versus if they were exhibited where they are now in a hallway gallery positioned in the Lyell McEwin Hospital, where people, staff and family members and kids and everybody uses on a day-to-day basis. I guess, how do you think the meaning of your work may change between those two?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that's something that I certainly need to think about, or, you know, it's something that is really relevant, because there's positives. I certainly don't think there's any negative to either, but there's real positives to both. You know, that commercial setting is, you know, better in the sense for, you know, sales and being an artist is more, traditional, in that sense, but there's equally, the opportunity to show the work in probably strangely more of a relevant setting, like in a hospital, like Lyell and McEwin, and having the public look at it is, I think, probably highlights the work kind of even more in a way. I think it certainly doesn't detract from the work. I think, particularly in this case, and the thing that excited me and wanted me, to work with CCH and share, the work in that setting was knowing, the role that CCH and kind of art in general plays, in health. I think there's, it's one thing to look at a really nice, beautiful colours, etc., that bring warmth or something and make someone feel good, but there's also that intellectually kind of stimulating aspect of, recovery or just health in general. Like, it's important to keep, your mind's kind of refreshed,
Definitely.
learning, all this kind of stuff. So that kind of setting, I think, works really well, because it's while the photos aren't from, the hospital per se, like, it's still the same kind of world. It's still, science. It's still that side of the coin. So I think it's a natural fit in a sense, and it's certainly good to hear feedback and get the public to look at it, but a different kind of crowd, showing in a gallery setting has its own kind of crowd. Showing in a hospital, you'll get probably the broadest crowd you can get. Hospital, everybody goes there, like, it doesn't matter who you are, like, that's a place for everyone. You need to go there. So it's really interesting,
particularly public space.
Exactly. It's the most, one of the most public spaces you can imagine. So it's really interesting in that sense. And I think especially for these kind of work, it works really nicely. Like, and it's almost a preferred space for me, because it's just the setting. It's these photos look, like, they might look nice on a white wall, but it's it's just a white wall. Like, you look at the photos and then you can turn around 10 meters and see, like, into X-ray laboratories or whatever they have like there. So it's just an interesting environment. I think it's I don't want to like rabble, but I think that kind of makes sense. It's interesting as well, because because it's like, this is talking about the work and writing about the work and stuff is completely different, and because it is a new kind of work and a long time kind of project, it's interesting to talk about these kind of things, because I'm kind of learning as I go. It's like, well, it's
and that's the thing I think about. I mean, I'm sure as an emerging artist, but definitely I think artists in general, I think that the thing about your practice is that it evolves with time, and it takes on different inspirations and different ideas, and okay, that doesn't work, or I'm going to return to this idea and move forward. And so I think that these experiences would absolutely inform, well, I hope that they would inform where you go next, which leads me conveniently to my last question, which is, what sort of spaces would you like to explore next? Are there, what would be a dream space of yours that you would like to photograph or represent in your work?
I think the next step for me is, I want to continue on, with the kind of university-based kind of spaces, because that's easier to do. It requires a little less planning and stuff. So it's even just a matter of just keeping kind of active, doing it, practicing your practice. But I think also from a kind of a partnership, collaboration kind of angle, there's an interesting element I want to explore more of, which is, how can we work together at the university? I'm photographing these amazing spaces. They, would love to share, these amazing spaces. How can we help each other do that? So the more I do of them, the more that process might develop.
Cool.
But certainly, steering away from that is the next kind of clear, direction for me. Getting into places like the SAMRI. I'm just waiting for COVID to let people back in before I can photograph them there, which would be amazing. To go from then, go from university up to specific kind of cancer research and these kind of things would be amazing. But then even extending to places of industry. I think about South Australian South Australian like producers and things. You know, think about the
Yeah.
Cooper's Brewery, or, you know, local brands and stuff that have these huge, you know,
Wow.
industries, and because it extends to, you know, not just science and research and engineering and stuff, but industry, you know, technology, like retail, all these spaces that are built for, you know, something. And that's probably one of the challenging things, I guess, is there's so much of it. Like, you know, it's not, it's like going out at night and going to take a photo. You just drive around and take a photo when you see it. But here it's, you can't quite do that. You can't quite just go somewhere and then like take a photo. You've got to go somewhere. You've got to, you know, get a tour. You've got to see inside. Like, you've got to kind of know what it is before you go there. And so much of it you'd have no idea about. You know, think about just walking, you know, between Adelaide Uni and stuff to go from one shoot, you know, to another, and you go past, you know, 10 different departments, and I've got no idea what's in these departments, unless I have some kind of access point. So yeah, so it's trying to manage those kind of access points. But certainly, you know, the good thing is I'm developing like a portfolio of work and almost clients, in the sense that you can say, like, you know, okay, Adelaide Uni SA, Flinders, you know, they've let me take photographs.
It's developed those relationships.
Yeah, rather than just being, you know, a student wanting to do something. I'm looking a bit more professional and a bit more as an artist. But I think probably the one that I really have my eyes set on is probably doing something with ASA, the Australian Space Agency, specifically with how, you know, in Adelaide, you know, we have you know, the national base for them. You know, we have so much going on around here and around the country that's developing right now. So to try to get in on the ground floor kind of thing, you know, not so much for what's happening now, but what's happening in the years to come. As someone, obviously, you can, you know, see behind me is something of an interest of mine. Like, that would be really exciting for me, just because it's you know, one of the whole points of this kind of work is combining, you know, photography, which is a passion, with a real genuine kind of interest. And so to be able to do something which is really you know, exciting and really kind of intriguing and learn kind of on the way would be kind of the main goal. And then who knows, like, that's the thing, you know, I've just started in Adelaide, you know, there's interstate, and then there's places, you know, around the world. Like, there's so
many places you could explore.
Exactly. Like, I don't want to think, like, when you ask, like, what's the dream, when you ask, like, what's the dream place, it's like, oh, to be go to NASA and photograph. It's like, you know,
that would be cool.
That would be amazing one day, sure. Like, that's the goal. But until then, you know, it's
slowly. But that's the beauty of it. Yeah, there's plenty
that is
to see.
Yeah, there's so much of it. That's everywhere. I think that's the real kind of thing that it comes back to, is that is so much of this kind of stuff happening everywhere that people aren't kind of aware of. And using, you know, kind of the arts, you know, environment to reflect that is, you know, what is kind of the main thing. So where it takes me, who knows, but it's like, that's the journey. Like, it's I mean, learning kind of.
I'm excited to see where it goes next. I think it sounds great. It's going to be really cool.
Thank you, Steph.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have left. But thank you so much for today, Taylor. It's been really great to chat with you about your practice, and of course the connections, particularly between arts and science and arts and health. I think that's been really meaningful, particularly in this environment. Thank you to everyone for tuning in as well. If you would like to learn more about Taylor's practice or CCH's arts and health programs, please visit our website or follow us on social media using the information below. That's all from us for now. Take care. Bye.
See ya.